Alrighty, everybody, welcome back. This is Rusty here with the Rugby Review, and for this episode, I'm going to be giving you a review of round 10 in the URC. And just to give everybody a quick reminder of the game schedule that was for round 10, on January 23rd, there were 3 games played, and on January 24th, there were 5 games played. And here we have the final results of all of the games. Starting on January 23rd, the first game played was between the Ospreys and the Lions, which ended up in a tie, 24-24. Game 2 on January 23rd was between Edinburgh and Vodacom Bulls. Bulls squeaked out a close victory there, 19-17. And the third and final game on January 23rd was between Munster and Dragons. Another close game there, with Munster getting the victory, 22-20. Now, the first game that was played on January 24th was between Zebre and Glasgow. Close game here as well, with Glasgow getting the victory, 26-21. Game 2 saw the first loss of the season to the Stormers. It was the Stormers versus the Sharks, with the Sharks getting the victory, 30-19. Game 3 was between Connacht and Leinster, a fun little Irish derby there, with Leinster getting the win, 34-23. Fourth game on the 24th was between Cardiff and Benetton, with Cardiff edging out Benetton 17-8. And the fifth and final game on January 24th was a very close game between Scarlets and Ulster, with the Scarlets getting the win 27-22. With all of that being said, let's take a deep dive into all of these games here, with our first game being between the Ospreys and the Lions. Again, this game ended in a tie. However, when we kind of deep dive into these stats here, we're going to see Ospreys were the team that was playing offense more and exerting offensive pressure on the Lions throughout most of the game, and the Lions had to put in a gigantic effort on defense to keep this game as close as it was. So let's zoom in on the top half here, and again, what we're going to see with the stats on the top half and the bottom half is Ospreys were the team that were dominant offensively in this game, and the Lions were having to put in a huge shift defensively. So possession and territory heavily favored towards Ospreys in the black ink. They have more possession, more territory. They're holding on to the ball more and playing in the Lions' half of the field more. If we look down at tackles made, this will emphasize the huge defensive effort the Lions had to put in this game. There is a massive difference between the tackles made. Ospreys made 120 tackles to 239 for the Lions. Again, just a huge defensive effort for the Lions this game. And to really drive home the point of Ospreys were the team exerting a lot of offensive pressure on the Lions, if we look down at meters gained, there is again a huge difference between the two teams here, with Ospreys gaining over 500 meters this game. Ospreys had 530 meters gained to 320 for the Lions. Again, Ospreys are the team that were dominant offensively this game, and Lions were relying heavily on defense. Now, the one thing, looking through all of this, there's one thing that killed the Ospreys and probably kept the Ospreys from securing the victory this game: handling errors. Look at turnovers lost. It's a gigantic difference between the two. 12 turnovers lost for the Ospreys to just 3 for the Lions. That's a massive difference there. And especially at the professional level, once you start getting 10 plus handling errors in the game, you're really just giving the other team a lot of opportunity to get back in the game or keep the game from getting too far afield. So very strong defensive effort by the Lions, and they took their opportunities when the Ospreys had their handling errors. Even still, Ospreys put in a huge shift offensively, so it was a very fun back and forth game to watch, considering how close it was. Now, our next game that we're moving into was another close game. It was Edinburgh versus the Bulls. Now, again, 2-point margin of victory here. And so what you'll see with this is it's very close, most of these stats between the two teams here. Now, what you'll see, especially with possession, territory, and tackles made, is Bulls were the team that had a slight edge in the offensive stats, which meant Edinburgh had to put in a little bit more work defensively. So again, if you look at possession plus territory, we can see both of those numbers are slightly favored towards the Bulls, which then makes sense as to why Edinburgh is making more tackles than the Bulls are. But again, not a huge difference between the two in those stats there. What I will say is, if we zoom in towards the bottom half here, I think Edinburgh was definitely more efficient with ball in hand when they had it. However, they didn't really, they didn't capitalize on being more efficient with ball in hand again. Vodacom Bulls, possession and territory was favored towards them. However, if we look at meters gained at the top of the slide here, it's pretty even and pretty comparable between the two. So even though the Bulls had more possession, more territory, Edinburgh was able to be more efficient with ball in hand when they did have it. And then if we look down at the bottom of the slide here with defenders beaten plus clean breaks, Edinburgh has more defenders beaten, more clean breaks than the Bulls do. So, despite being a little bit more efficient with ball in hand, I think Edinburgh, again, they left some opportunities on the table. It's unfortunate not the first time that's happened this year. But again, they left some opportunities on the table. Bulls were able to take advantage and secure the victory against Edinburgh this week. Now, our third and final game for Friday was, again, our third close competition this week between Munster and the Dragons. This was, as we look a little closer into this, very strong offensive performance by Munster, forcing the Dragons to put in a huge shift defensively. Dragons were very efficient with ball in hand when they had it. However, ill discipline is what kind of shot the Dragons in the foot and really kept the Dragons from kind of emphasizing how efficient they were with ball in hand. So anyway, let's zoom in, and again, it's a very strong offensive performance for Munster. We can see that with possession plus territory. Both are heavily skewed towards Munster in this game, which forced Dragons to make a huge effort defensively, which you will see with tackles made. So Dragons are making over twice the amount of tackles as Munster is. Munster made 100 tackles. Dragons had to make 229. Now, if we look down at meters gained here real quick, again, with possession and territory being so heavily skewed and favored towards Leinster, you wouldn't think meters gained would be, yes, Munster does have a slight edge in it. However, when your possession and territory are as dominant as Munster was this particular game, you would think that there would be a much, much bigger difference in meters gained, not just a 38-meter difference. So, very efficient offensively by the Dragons when they did have ball in hand, even though they had to put in a massive shift defensively. Now again, Dragons very efficient with ball in hand. And just like I said at the beginning, ill discipline, I think, is what got Dragons in trouble and really let Munster eke out this win. So if you look down at defenders beaten and clean breaks first, despite having a very small amount of possession during the course of the game, the Dragons were able to have over twice the number of defenders beaten as Munster. Munster only had 8 defenders beaten, while Dragons had 19 defenders beaten. Munster didn't translate any of those defenders beaten into clean breaks. Dragons turned 19 defenders beaten into 5 clean breaks. So very efficient offensively from the Dragons, but let's look up at penalties conceded. Munster was very disciplined during this game, only giving up 6 penalties. However, Dragons gave up 12. So, despite the efficiency on offense by the Dragons, their ill discipline is what allowed Munster to eke out and secure this victory. So, a little bit to be desired, so to speak, by the Dragons. I think this is one that they let slip away, but very hard-fought, well-earned victory by Munster in this particular game. So moving on to our next game, we're starting the Saturday games here, and pretty close game here between Zebre and Glasgow. Zebre towards the bottom end of the table, Glasgow towards the top end of the table. So it was pretty nice to see that this was a one-score game between the two teams here. Now, there's not much in between the two teams here. Glasgow had the possession and territory stats in their favor, which meant Zebre was playing a little bit more on the defensive side. Now, I will say, Zebre was very efficient and a little bit more effective with their ball in hand as opposed to Glasgow. So let's zoom in on the bottom half here. And we can see meters gained stat here. So possession and territory was very slightly favored towards Glasgow. However, despite the possession stat favoring Glasgow, Zebre were able to outgain Glasgow during this entire game. So you can see that with the meters gained stat there. There's 311 meters gained for Zebre Parma to the 266 for Glasgow. Now, what I think gave Glasgow the slight edge in this particular game is ill discipline by Zebre Parma. So if we look down at penalties conceded, 13 penalties conceded for Parma to just 8 for Glasgow. Again, not a huge difference there, but enough of a difference where a team like Glasgow will take advantage of the ill discipline that Parma showcased during this particular game. So, good win for Glasgow. In addition, there's a lot of positives that Parma can take from this game, having been able to compete with one of the top teams in the URC. Now, our next game we're going to be going through is a very, very fun South African derby. Now, this is the first loss in the URC season for the Stormers. This is kind of a big deal here, where the Sharks were able to go on the road and secure a road victory against the top of the table team right here. And I will say, this was very, very strong performance by the Sharks, and they were able to make the Stormers, it almost seemed like the Sharks were able to make the Stormers a little uncomfortable during the course of this game, so to speak. But let's zoom in on our stats here. We've got the Sharks in the black ink, Stormers in the blue ink, and we can see with possession plus territory both favoring towards the Sharks, which put Stormers under defensive pressure during the entire course of this game, and you can see that with the tackles made stat. So, possession territory favoring the Sharks. Stormers put under a bunch of pressure defensively. 155 tackles made for the Stormers to just 88 for the Sharks. So again, really great job by the Sharks to exert offensive pressure on the Stormers, and the Stormers just had to absorb a lot of defensive pressure during the course of this game. Now, I will say, even though possession is favored towards the Sharks, when Stormers did have ball in hand, they were very efficient with it compared to the Sharks. Let's look at the meters gained stat at the bottom here. 293 meters gained for Stormers to 262 for the Sharks. Again, since the Stormers had less possession, you would figure the Sharks would have more meters gained. However, Stormers did a really good job at being efficient and effective with ball in hand. Now, if we look further down the stat sheet here, I think a lot of the Stormers' problems revolved around ill discipline this particular game. You can see they had a handful or 3 more penalties conceded than the Sharks did. In addition, more turnovers lost for the Stormers than the Sharks as well. So I think the defensive pressure ended up getting to the Stormers at some point in time, and that ill-disciplined allowed the Sharks to have scoring opportunities. But again, I will say the Stormers were very efficient and very effective with ball in hand when they did have it. If you look down at defenders beaten plus clean breaks, Stormers had more clean breaks on less defenders beaten. So when the Stormers did have their opportunity, they were able to take it. However, the defense from the Sharks was able to keep the Stormers from utilizing these scoring opportunities when they were available. Moving to our next game, it's a lovely Irish derby here between Connacht and Leinster. Now, what's interesting here, it's very, it's a 2-score margin of victory for Leinster here. I don't know, they have an 11-point margin of victory here. What's interesting is, you look at the stat sheet here and it's very comparable. All the stats are very, very similar, right? Possession territory, about as close as you're going to get without being 50-50. Tackles made, very comparable. Tackles missed, success rate for the tackles. This top half of the stat sheet here looks very, very similar, almost as if the score should be a tie. Now, where I think Leinster was able to take advantage and kind of spread that score out is being very effective and efficient on offense. Been saying that a lot this week. So if we look down at the bottom here, despite Connacht's slight edge in possession and territory, it did not translate into more meters gained. When Leinster had the ball, they were more effective with it, more efficient with it. They were able to gain more yards. They had more clean breaks, which led to more scoring opportunities, which, again, led them to be able to have this victory against Connacht this week. So, despite possession and territory edge to Connacht, Leinster was still able to put a lot of offensive pressure on Connacht and secure the victory against Connacht this week, which was very helpful for Leinster in their continued rise up the URC ladder. Our next game, our second to last game, was Cardiff versus Benetton. As I have looked through the stat sheet here, I'm going to be honest with you. I really think Benetton, I think Benetton let this one slip away from them, because as we shall see, especially once we start getting towards meters gained and whatnot, Benetton statistically may have been the better team during the course of this game. Possession and territory is flip-flop, so yes, possession was favored towards Cardiff, territory was favored towards Benetton, so it's pretty 50-50 there. Despite having less possession during the course of the game, Benetton forced Cardiff to make a good chunk more tackles than what Benetton had to do, so 173 tackles for Cardiff to 141 for Benetton. In addition, if you look at tackles missed, Cardiff is not only making more tackles, but they're missing significantly more of them. So, defensively, Benetton was on it today. Offensively, they were not on it. However, if you look down at meters gained, you wouldn't have necessarily thought, oh, Benetton doesn't have it this week. But you look at the meters gained again. 256 for Cardiff, 324 meters gained for Benetton. You would figure having that meters gained edge plus that tackle success rate edge would have manifested a much bigger margin of victory, or a victory in general, which fortunately was not the case this week. Even as we look down here, Benetton had one more turnovers at the breakdown, had less handling errors. Both teams were pretty well disciplined this week, and then look at defenders beaten. Benetton had 27 defenders beaten to just 7 for Cardiff, yet Benetton ends up losing this game. So I think this is a matter of Benetton lost this game, not Cardiff winning this game, if that makes sense. So a little bit to be desired there for Benetton, because I think they beat themselves this week, but I don't think any Cardiff fan is going to be too upset that they were able to secure the victory against Benetton. Last but not least, we've got Scarlets versus Ulster. It was a great game, very back and forth. Scarlets barely won with an 83rd minute score, and when we go through this, I think this is going to be a situation where Ulster will feel like they lost the game instead of Scarlets winning, because of how strong of a performance Ulster put in this week, or this particular game. Again, possession and territory heavily skewed towards Ulster in the red ink, forcing Scarlets to put in a huge shift defensively, and you can see that with the tackles made stat. There's just a huge difference between the two teams. What's interesting, though, is looking down at meters gained. There's a good difference here, right? 221 meters gained for Scarlets to 270 for Ulster. However, I would think with a possession stat that's so favorited towards Ulster, 61% possession towards Ulster, 67% territory in the favor of Ulster, would lead to more than just a 49-meter advantage in the meters gained stat. That's just my opinion. But what I will say is Ulster kind of shot themselves in the foot with a lot of ill discipline around handling. As you can see with turnovers lost, Scarlets only had 1 turnover lost to handling errors versus 10 for Ulster. I understand that the Scarlets are at the bottom of the table, but when there is a huge difference in handling errors, such as 10-1, even teams at the bottom of the table can play a good enough rugby game where they can take advantage of the ill discipline by the other team. So, strong win by the Scarlets. Ulster will, again, probably be thinking that they lost the game more than Scarlets won the game. So let's look at the live ladder here. On the left side of the screen, where it says January 5th, we can see, it's not the right year, but that's okay. On the January 5th date, that was the standings as of round 9. And on the right side of the screen is the standings as of round 10. Now, the reason for the Christmas-colored theme with the ink here is to showcase what teams are moving up and what teams are moving down the leaderboard here. So all the teams in the green ink have moved up and gained spots this past round. All the teams in the red ink have dropped down spots this particular week. So there was a lot of movement with only 3 teams maintaining and keeping their position. So a lot of movement up and down the ladder here with much, much more to come. So again, thank you all for tuning in and listening to the video. If you liked it, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and stay tuned for the next episode going over round 11 in the URC. Speaking of round 11, before I leave, here is the game schedule for round 11. 2 games played on January 30th, with the 6 remaining games played on February 1st. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next time.